第五节，麦克哈森教授的这个第五节的题目是如何获取地租，征税还是国有化？应该说这是个老问题啊。这个我们在前几节曾经介绍中国的这个民主革命的先驱孙中山先生，他呢在他的这个思想中就明确强调啊，只要我能够把土地涨价，也就是说稽查地租，我能够收归国有，我就可以免除所有的企业的税收，乃至于个人所得税，他都能全免。他算了账，他认为这个是很合理的。但同时他也提出叫做节制资本，平均地权。你只有节制资本才能平均地权，这二者不可偏废。你不能鼓励资本的同时，你去平均地权，因为资本是要占有土地、占有资源，它来获得资本化收益的，也就是资本是要吃租的。这一点呢，在这个迈克尔哈森教授的第4节，他讲了金融资本如何通过对房地产的这个投资来形成地租，以金融的利率来获得地租的这个分享，他有这么一个规律性的分析。那我们回头看，如果我们看到了地租其实是一个摧毁实体经济的这么一个重要因素的话，那么到底是孙中山先生所说的土地涨价应该归公呢，还是我们现在很多地方这个政策上所实际上采取的土地涨价归私？这就是个和我们的现实有直接相关的问题了。那我们来看哈森教授他说呢，这关键点还是要讨论国家如何才能有效的获取地租。他说历史上呢，那些罗马元老院、英国上议院等等，那统治阶级呢取消了经济租的概念，因此呢，这个租呢就仍然是在那些旧的势力的手里，这就导致这个工业化面对的传统的势力非常强大。那当后来地租又转化为金融租的情况之下，那就更难以被国有化，因为金融大家都知道，美国是世界金融资本的国际秩序的制定者。那美国的金融资本组成的叫做美联储，美联储是私人性质的，它怎么可能？很多讨论都是集中在这一点上哪怕美国的总统他作为全国的统帅，他想把金融权力收归政府都不可能。所以这个道理呢，就要跟大家讲清楚，就是说你要想回归传统政治经济学，就要进行政治斗争。但是同时呢，大家都知道，在土地私有化的条件下，那你让土地的所有者不收租，这个东西似乎是很大的一个难题。谁是使用他的土地都要先交地租嘛？种地交租似乎是天经地义的。所以怎么才能解决问题呢？那迈克尔哈茨教授他的这个从西方出发所提出的理论呢，就是只有土地国有化。那同时呢，土地国有化的这个基础上呢，要对国有土地的这个地租由国家来进行征税。他给出了一个是按照政治经济学的理论推导出来的一个解决方案。
So in any case, farming in today's world has become so industrialized that the theory of differential rent is much less significant. But there's monopoly rent in industry, and there's monopoly rent in the grain trading monopolies in America. Cargill and Archer Daniels buy most of the rent from the farmers. The farmers are being squeezed, having to sell their milk or their grain or their corn at a low price. Big distribution companies they make the profit. So the rent of location is now pretty minimal because canning companies and packing companies have moved to where things are produced. So what remains is basically a financialized economic rent. Now look at how the fight to tax this failed. Again, you have John Stuart Mill and other land taxers. How are you going to be able to get rid of the rents to the landlord class? Well, it had to be political. And so the advocates of industry not only were for industrial reform, making industry more efficient, in order to feed their labor lower wages, they had to fight for democracy. They had to empower the House of Commons to be more powerful than the House of Lords, to prevent the landlord class, the House of Landlords, from blocking the land tax. And so there was a long fight in England, and that culminated in 1909 and 1910 when the House of Commons passed the land tax. But hardly by surprise, the House of Lords vetoed it. And that was what senates were able to do ever since ancient Rome. They could always veto laws passed by the popular assembly. And so there was a constitutional crisis that was resolved in 1910. Never again could the House of Lords veto a revenue act passed by the House of Commons. So you had the fight for democracy, ironically enough, was fought by the industrial capitalist class. It was opposed by the landlord class, and gradually the banking class came to unify its class interests with the industrial class. To free industrial class, economics became a political economy. That's why they called themselves political economists in the 19th century. What was political was getting rid of the House of Lords and the political stranglehold on governments that the landlords have, just like the financial class in the United States has become the donor class and control the election process, as you've seen with the American presidential election. So throughout Europe, the aristocratic upper house no longer was able to block the reforms. A fight then broke out over, well, how do we prevent rent extraction from impoverishing industrial economics? And there were two approaches. The least revolutionary approach is Ricardo's proposal. Free trade. If you have free trade, you'll buy lower priced food abroad, and that way you're not going to have any monopoly. but the corn laws are repealed. You still had monopolies. So John Stuart Mill sought to make rent the tax base. Well, that's something. How do you tax away the rent? They were never able to do it. The more radical way was to nationalize the land outright. The socialists said you can't just tax the land very little, because the landlord class is always able to get loopholes. It's able to do all sorts of crooked, corrupt political maneuvering. You have to own the land, just as governments own mines and other natural resources, just as you have natural infrastructure monopolies, government should own the land. So socialists aim to make the land and basic infrastructure part of the public domain. Well, it was part of China owns the land, Hong Kong owns the land, but the problem is you have to not only own the land, you have to tax away. The whole purpose of owning the land is to get the land rent. And if the government owns the land, but it doesn't tax the land rent, then it's just as if it doesn't own it. It's just as if it still leaves the privilege of getting the land rent in the hands of the landlords. And that was the fight that broke off in the 19th century. The second fight is how did the government get to own the land? There was a fight over should it buy the land from the landlords for about a decade. People argued, well, let's just buy the land. Just like in the United States, there were suggestions that the North should buy the slaves from the slave owners and free them. Well, the problem is if you bought the land is the most valuable asset in any economy. And if you just created money to pay the landlords for the land, you'd make them into the new landlord class, but it wouldn't be the landlord class, it would be the money lord class. It would be the financial class. And so obviously, if you're going to buy out the land, you want to first tax away the rent, so the land has almost no value. The value of land is the capitalized value of the rent. How much will you pay in order to get so much rent per year? If there's no rent to be got, then obviously the value of the land is low. So when it's $1 an acre or 1 yen per acre, that's the point at which you want to buy the land. So first you tax it, and then you take it into the public domain. Once it's in the public domain, you're in charge of appraising it every year. In the United States, buildings and land are appraised every year or two. In the United States, there are tens of thousands of land appraisers that go around appraising the land. They don't exist in England because the land interest don't want to be paid. But they'll say, here's how much the land is going up, here's how much the building is going up. And their differential rate, the land is taxed at such and such a rate, buildings at such and such a rate. The question is, you wouldn't have to tax buildings at all if you got the full value of the land. But the land tax in America is only limited to about 1% of the overall real estate value, and that's hardly any percent. Because if you're willing to pay 6% to the mortgage banker to buy the property, then obviously 6% is a lot more than 1%. You're leaving the land rent to be paid to the creditors, and that's you don't want the banking class simply to replace the landlord class, and that's what's happened in the United States. Well, what made industrial capitalism so politically revolutionary was the political fight between opponents of land taxation, the House of Lords, and the land reformers, the progressive movement. And that's why finally, once the failure of to tax the land developed in the early 20th century, economics got rid of all the classical economists. It got rid of value and price theory. It got rid of the labor theory of value. In order to avoid the discussion by Marx and the socialists, they got rid of everything that had been economics from the time of the physiocrats, les économistes. And they said there's the new doctrine that was begun to be popularized in the 1890s in the United States was there's no distinction between price and value. Value is what anybody would pay in the marketplace. So once you get rid of the distinction between price and value, there's no more economic rent. Because if rent is the difference between price and value, then and there's no difference, then nobody's a rentier and everybody earns the income.
那对我们来说呢，恐怕就有一些值得我们讨论的地方，因为我们是有着相当多的这个国有土地的，比如我们城市的土地就是完全是国家所有的，我们农业用地也其中有相当一部分呢是国有的农场、国有的林场。那我们的土地确有相当部分是国家所有的，那有没有可能国家在这个过程中间完整的获取地租的增量收益呢？比如就这个土地上架归公，我们做到没做到呢？很大程度上还得分析着来，因为实际上国家征用了土地，支付了土地变现的成本，就从农业用地变为工业用地了。但是为了能够招商引资，那很多地方呢是零地租、零地价的向投资商转让土地，尤其是对海外投资。各地很多发达地区制定的政策是海外投资得到最低价的土地，甚至零地价。为什么？因为海外投资便宜，这仍然是一种变相的金融租。很多人都不理解海外投资为什么便宜。我刚才讲到了2008年美国救市政策，奥巴马给出的超级量化宽松。什么叫超级啊？零利率，就是大量印钞。那这个印钞投向市场呢是零利率。那你经过银行转手加上手续费，也不过再加个1%、2%。所以呢，到了投资人手里边，那个美国代表的这个，当然美国之后是欧洲，欧洲之后日本都量化宽松，都是超级量化宽松，都是极低的利率甚至零利率。于是西方资本大量的被制造出来，但是最低价格，资本价格最低啊。比如当然中国自己国内还得对付各种各样的，因为你大量进口他们制造的能源通胀、原材料通胀，于是说你的利率就不可能低啊。那我们在利率维持官方利率在7厘8厘的这个水平上的时候，那人家西方的利率是1厘2厘， 因此只要进来了，坐地人家就有3倍到4倍的这个收益。那这个廉价的外资当然是各级地方政府争相招商的对象了。也就是说，你的国内其实等于让渡了地租，对吧？这个道理呢，我觉得恐怕很少有人去关注这种国内的现象。Michael Hudson 讲的是从西方的土地私有制、金融私有制这个角度，他用传统的政治经济学理论，他做的分析，那当然很有价值，并且指出呢，西方的出路是土地的国有化，当然其实也应该包括金融的国有化。但是对西方来说，尤其对美国来说，它恐怕是做不到的。这一点呢，如果回忆美国的历史，就是它为什么一定是私人的，就是因为它早期是一批西方的穷人大船送过来，然后大家每个人手里都得有枪吧，因为你还得对付各种各样的土著，当然也包括自然界的各种各样的风险了。于是乎呢，这就是一个各种各样的私人在这儿做扩张。当然，官方要安排个总督了，那你私人扩张出来的这些资源呢，总督给你盖个章，就算是你个人的了，等等切切。所以它是一个从开始就是这么一种个人来到这个大陆，然后做新大陆的扩张等等等等，这个是它的历史。所以它一开始就是私人的，当然它的银行一开始也是完全是私人的它不可能去像我们这样，土地可以是国有的，比如城市土地就是100%完全国有，但是因为地方政府各自的利益不同，所以它实际上并不能真正体现所以公有制。我们的情况和他的情况完全不同，所以大家在听这个美国教授的分析的时候呢，如果把美国的教授的分析以及他所使用的理论完全带入到我们的话语环境之中，恐怕还是要多一些讨论的。好，我就说到这儿，谢谢大家。